Hugh, thank you for accepting to talk to us. I want to just talk leadership. And I think we see a lot of billions invested every year in leadership development. At the same time, we notice that the world does not have maybe the leaders it deserves. What do you think of this? Why this paradox?
Well, I would say, right away in your language, there's a problem. You talk about we don't have the leaders we need. And to me, that's a huge problem because we confuse leadership with authority. Like we give someone the title of mayor or CEO, or here in the rest of the world, like the president of the United States is the leader of the free world. Well, that's the problem, because there's no guarantee it's simply because someone has a position of authority that we'll see leadership. But we confuse it when we think that we give someone authority and then he or she is a leader. So I'd say that's a really important distinction it's not clear out there and needs to be. So we tend to think of leadership as not a position or a role. There are no leadership positions. There are positions of authority, So we think of leadership as an activity. It's not something you're given in a position. It's something we choose. It's an activity, an action that we choose. And then that gets us to a second distinction, that it has to do with leadership has to do with the kind of problems that we face. And, when an organization or a community already has in its repertoire both the information and skills that are needed to address that problem, that's fine, That good management expertise, we can solve that problem. It's more complex when we have certain problems where we might agree on why the problem exists, but conflict on how to address it. It's a messy one. Well, the really messy ones, we don't agree on the nature of the problem to begin with. Talk to people like, why is climate change a problem? Well, you get umpteen theories. Or I'm from Northern Ireland, and you ask, why are people fighting in Northern Ireland? Depends who you talk, which group you talk to. They have a different definition of why that problem exists. So we'd say that leadership is the activity of pulling together and mobilizing all those various groups who have different, conflicting interpretations of what reality is, what the challenges are, values that are in conflict, their identities are sick. That's the activity of leadership. So what we need is people in positions of authority or with that who can, exercise leadership in that way. That's why I think the title leader is it's become so dysfunctional these days.
So if leadership is an activity and someone is thinking of, I want to exercise this activity, I want to do it, are there any pre-requirements for this activity to be practiced? Or is this something that you should learn to be able to practice leadership in the right way?
I think it's something we need to learn, where most of us, particularly in Western cultures, have been really indoctrinated with this idea of the leader as a role. The traditional theory of the trait leader, it has to do with certain capacities that we need for leadership. It's recognized that trait theory is no longer works, but it's still deeply ingrained, So leadership, it's learned. It can be learned. The other point about leadership, as I said, leadership has to do with and it's meaningless, really, divorce from purpose. It has to do with what are the changes, what moves our energy to want to see some change from current reality, current state of affairs, to something new. So it has to be, if it's based in purpose, and then we sort of learn our way from current state of affairs to some new one.
Uncertainty is peaking somehow in every field. That a lot of uncertainties, whether politically or even economically. A lot of people are somehow as certain about what would be the next step. At the same time, we feel like a lot of authority figures, they're selling that business of certainty to people. And usually it works. So for someone is willing to exercise leadership with integrity and honesty, it's so uncertain around them. Is there a way for them just also to be able to exercise leadership while everybody else is selling this certainty, and usually with a very populist discourse?
Yes, that's a huge challenge globally. The reality is in politics as we traditionally know it, and power, those will become divorced. We used to think we give power to the politicians, the authority figures, they would know what to do. If power is the capacity to do stuff and politics is the capacity to know what to do, give the power to the authority figures, and they know what to do. Well, see, the challenges we face now are beyond any nation state. Poverty, inequality, immigration, climate change. they're not within the purview of any nation state to solve. So those we give authority to can no longer solve the problems. Authority figures sort of get trapped in feeling they have to meet this obligation to provide answers to problems for which they don't have answers. And one of my colleagues says that his definition of leadership is the rate at which you disappoint your own people without them bumping you off. The authority figure are part of the system, and they don't have answers to these messy challenges we face. But unless they're vulnerable and willing to say, I don't know, they get trapped. And again, our education system, again, particularly in the West, don't train us to be fine with not knowing. To see not knowing is actually not an evil, but it's actually the nature of reality. We don't know the next moment. There is no certainty about the next moment. And rather than see that, embrace that and understand that, as if we're willing to live in that space of not knowing, then we can be creative about the future, what's to come. If I'm locked into needing to be certain and to know the answers, you see, there is no creativity. So I'd say that one of the most important capacities we sort of try to teach here is for people to have this capacity to embrace, acknowledge, and tolerate uncertainty. Not just tolerate, to actually embrace it.
So word challenges, they seem to be somehow a collective sport. You need to, as a team, plan a change. But every time one wants to play this as an individual sport within their own jurisdiction, which created less curiosity about the other, more conflict, someone solving the problem. Just to ask maybe, what would be a way to turn global challenges into a team sport when everyone will own the mess they have, but also contribute to solving the problem without necessarily having that zero-sum game?
Well, yeah, this requires a shift in global consciousness, and a mind shift from self to the other. To Otto Scharmer talks about this as a shift from egocentric thought to echo. Like from me to the whole. We know human beings, we're one family before we're different. No child is tossed out of the womb identifying as Irish or Tunisian or whatever. There's one human family, but developed this tribal identity structures that becomes divisive. I think what's required now globally is this recognition. We have to think on behalf of the whole human family. For example, the United Nations, which is the best we have, something like 193 countries represented, was supposed to bring an end to conflict. But what tends to happen is that each country shows up with their flag, and they're on behalf of the Irish flag, or there's the Indian representative, or there's a Russian. They're all there looking for their piece of the pie for their group. But can you imagine what it'd be like if all these representatives were able to leave that national flag, group identity flag outside the door and show up on behalf of the whole family? To me, that's the vision I have. That's where what's required now. The challenges that we face globally have brought us to this moment. And unless there's this recognition that we're in it together, and these challenges can only be met cooperatively as one family, then we'll keep trying to deal with symptoms rather than the full picture.
The past 2 years, many conflicts were all over the world, Middle East, Sudan, South America. With your experience on conflict resolution, conflict management, I'm not really looking for a recipe, but how can we approach conflict resolution with the complexity we have now?
I think what's required, again, in terms of leadership, is what one writer writing about leadership said, that maybe the most important capacity that any of us need for the exercise of leadership, he refers to it as a non-anxious presence. So anyone trying to mediate, trying to bring people in conflict together, they need to, certainly in this quality in themselves, a non-anxious presence. Because the conflict system is, people are swept away in anger and rage. Someone, and this is the leadership challenge, has to have that capacity in order to be able to create a container that will, first of all, find a way to invite the conflicting parties into that container and hold them through the very, messy, fiery process of sharing how they see reality differently and how they see the other as guilty for their suffering, So someone has to have that capacity to create that process. And then the challenge is how to, leadership's way, all you're doing is holding up a mirror to, we use the metaphor of the participants, the conflict players, they're on a dance floor. They can't see the dance. They can't see the system that they're creating. So the leadership challenge is to help each party see it's not the other responsible for this. And everyone has a part. Everyone's colluding in getting what we're getting. And unless the parties own that and take responsibility for that, they just keep churning out the same old patterns of behavior. So to me, that's key. It's like this capacity for stillness, to hold container and to help parties see it's their colluding in sabotaging the very thing they want. They'll say they want peace, but to keep repeating actions that keep the conflict going. So help them see that so that they take responsibility for that and connect to a deeper purpose of real peace.
You mentioned this idea of, instead of resolving the conflict, orchestrate the conflict. If we take one of the long-lasting conflicts like Turkey and Armenia, how can we get two groups from both these countries actually to work together, and somehow what takes you to orchestrate conflict instead of trying to approach the solve?
I've done some work with Turks and Armenians, and it was clear, for example, on the Armenian side, for 150 years, whatever it is now, they've been trying to get the Turks to say you did it, say it was genocide. The problem is it's not working. After 150 years, it's not working. And in fact, Turkish participants say they feel like they're up against the wall and being beaten over the head, say you did it, say you did. So, for example, what would an Armenian have to sort of face if they're to decide, look, this strategy isn't working, maybe we need to stop and think of something else? So here you have a group that been, this has been their main strategy for 150 years. So for them to think about recognizing it's not working and give that up, the loss they would have to feel, the fear of what happened will never be recognized. That's one of the challenging aspects of conflict. It's not change people resist, it's loss. So for them, that's just one example. But then the Turkish side, there were some people in the group I was working with. It was only one who used the word genocide. The others would say the G word or the terrible events of 1915, So again, what is it that for a Turkish person what's at stake to use the word genocide? There's some deep fear of people being, honored, civilization somehow being shamed. And so there's these losses and fears for identities that are at stake. Those have to surface and be addressed. And part of the process is holding people through loss. What do we give up for something different, some better reality? Because unless that happens, we just keep repeating same old patterns.
For those exercising leadership, what would be 3 pieces of advice before they start this journey?
Be very clear and get as clear as you can on your purpose. Leading for what? Leadership in meaningless terms unless it's got purpose at its core. So then recognizing that, first of all, that leadership is an activity. It's not a position. You can lead with or without authority. You can't lead alone. So be in the business of connecting, building allies purposefully. So those are the 3 key steps.